So, this sermon is actually the result of a mental journey that I went on. And to spare you the trauma of the trip through my ADD brain, I am just going to give you the first part and the last part. I should also add that this isn't really so much about the text and what it might mean as it is using the text as a biblical example of the matter at hand. Because the idea for the sermon began with the first attacks on Iran. And as usual, when something like that happens in the world, you can almost hear certain Christian gears start turning. Trouble in the Middle East, military action, Israel, Iran, America, prophecy charts come out, rapture language wakes up. Somebody somewhere starts talking about Jesus as though Jesus just checked the calendar and said, well, now seems dramatic enough. And that made me think of how many Christians imagine the end of the world as one final cosmic event. One day everything is normal, the next day the sky opens, history stops, and God sweeps the faithful out of the wreckage. But Isaiah is speaking to a people who already know something that we often forget or don't take into account. And that is, a world can end long before the world ends. A country collapses, a temple burns, a family breaks. Your world can end while the mail still runs, and the neighbor still mows his lawn, and the grocery store still has bananas. That's the strange cruelty of grief and these endings, because the world ends and everybody else just keeps buying Fruity Pebbles. And Isaiah is speaking to a people who know that cruelty. Jerusalem had fallen, exile had happened, the old structures of meaning cracked. The people who thought they knew who they were had been carried into a life that they didn't choose. So when Isaiah says the heavens will vanish like smoke and the earth will wear out like a garment, he's not speaking to people casually curious about the future. He's speaking to a people who are standing in the ashes of what used to be. The visible world does not hold forever. Nations do not, buildings do not, bodies definitely don't, systems do not. Even the world as we know it does not. But Isaiah says God's salvation will not wear out, God's deliverance will not end. That is not the same thing as saying nothing will ever fall apart. It means that when things do fall apart, God is not finished. And that's a different kind of hope, which is not an escape from a fragile world or any denial that worlds end. It's not a religious fantasy where faith means nothing bad happens. Hope is when that world ends, God can still bring life on the other side. And here is the part that we may not like. The person who comes through their world ending is not the same person that went in. When a world ends, you don't just return to who you were before. You emerge altered. You may be more tender. You may be less certain. You can carry a limp. You may no longer laugh at the same things or tolerate the same nonsense. When that world ends, something dies, something else begins. And so I bring you to where that path led me, and this is to baptism. And I'm not talking baptism like church paperwork or as this religious box that got checked long ago and mostly forgotten or anything like that. I'm talking about baptism as the church's sign that God brings people through death and into a changed life. Burial, washing, rising. And that pattern didn't begin, by the way, with Christians. Long before the church existed, Israel knew that water could mark passage from one condition into another. In Leviticus, a person healed from skin diseases or leprosy has to wash before returning to the community. And then in both Leviticus and Numbers, you have to wash every time there's a bodily discharge, if you come into contact with something that is dead, or any other of the ritual impurities. Blood cleansed the temple, water cleansed the body. And those washings are not one and done. They are repeatable. In fact, many of them are required to be repeatable. Because life, believe it or not, keeps happening. Bodies keep changing. Death keeps touching us. The holy and the ordinary keep brushing against each other. People keep crossing thresholds that need to be marked. Now, do not misunderstand me. I am not saying we need to take over every detail of Leviticus and Numbers. Nobody needs to panic and start checking the church basement for spare goats. But I do think that those texts understand something that we've forgotten. That there are passages and times in our lives that deserve water. That there are changes that are so deep that our soul needs a sign. That there are thresholds that people should not have to cross invisibly. A person who is diagnosed with cancer is not the same person they were before. The person going through treatment is not the same person who first heard the diagnosis. And the person who is told that the cancer is in remission is not simply back to normal. That person has crossed through fear and weakness and waiting and medicine and pain and hope and the terrible silence between phone calls. And why would the church have no water for that? A marriage ends. A spouse dies. A job disappears. A family fractures. A person overcomes addiction. A child is born. A parent is buried. A war follows someone home. A life collapses, and somehow by grace, that person is still here. Why would the church have no water for that? We say baptism means death and resurrection, burial and new life, right? But then we act as though its meaning must be kept safely behind glass and admired once, recorded once, and then never touched again. And I understand the caution in the church's language about this, because I don't want there to be any implication that God's initial claim has somehow failed us. We don't want to turn baptism into some kind of religious restart button we press every time life gets hard. And that's fair enough. But the older water traditions weren't afraid of repetition. The mikvah, the ritual bath that everybody had to take that I mentioned in Numbers and Leviticus, that mikvah was repeatable because human beings were passing from one state into another, even if it was simply the state of unclean to clean. And water marked that crossing. Water told the truth. Water said, you're not pretending nothing happened. You are entering life changed. And I think maybe the church needs to recover that courage. You can call it whatever you want. Call it a reaffirmation, call it a return to the water, but don't make it so tame as to be meaningless. And I'm going to say something that's going to get me in a lot of trouble if anybody up the ranks for me hears this, but our reaffirmation of baptism ritual is weak and would serve nobody in those positions at any time. It's just a few polite drops of nostalgia. If someone has passed through death and come out altered, the church ought to have a way to say so with the whole body. I mean, think of Exodus, right? The people are still slaves until they cross through the water and onto the other side, and the water closes behind them. They cease being slaves then and become a people. That's quite often how God works. Water doesn't just clean, it unmakes and remakes. Ezekiel carries the image even further, speaking to the exiles, to the people whose national life has collapsed. God promises clean, living water. But the promise doesn't stop with the washing. God also promises a new heart and a new spirit in that. Water, heart, spirit, all new. Cleansing and transformation. Not washed so that we can go back unchanged. Washed because we can't go back unchanged. And that's what Christian baptism gathers up. Paul says we're buried with Christ in baptism and raised with him. 1 Peter says baptism is not simply dirt being washed from the body, but an appeal to God through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Baptism isn't just water touching the skin. It is God naming the deepest pattern of Christian life. Down into death, up into life. The old world ended, the new creation has come. So I know the old argument, we baptize once because God is faithful once and for all. Yes, true. But human life is not once and for all. Human life keeps ending and beginning We keep burying lives we thought would be the ones to last forever. And we keep emerging as people we didn't even know we could become. And we keep needing the church to stand with us in those times and saying this death was real, this crossing was real, this life is real too. And this is exactly where Christian end of the world rapture theology fails us. Because it teaches people to look at a world that is breaking and ask, oh, when do we get out of here? And while Scripture keeps asking harder questions, when a world breaks, what kind of person will God bring through it? Or what kind of people? Certainly not a people who stare at war and rub their hands together because prophecy charts start feeling exciting again. Not a people who treat suffering nations as scenery for end time scenarios. Not people who turn fear into entertainment and call it faith. God is forming people who can pass through death and still bear witness to life. People who can see worlds end without surrendering to despair. People who can be washed of old idolatries and old cruelties and old evasions and old fears. People who do not need the old world restored exactly as it was in order to trust God. So when a world ends, I would encourage you not to rush too quickly and say, when are things going to get back to normal? Because sometimes normal was part of what needed to die. Don't only ask, how do I get my old life back? Ask, what new faithfulness is being raised from it? Because after a world ends, God may not give you the old world back. God may give you a new heart, a new spirit. That doesn't make the loss any easier, of course, but baptism is not sentimental either. No one who has watched a casket lowered into the ground needs to be told that burial is poetic. It's unhelpful. No one who has packed boxes after a divorce or cleaned out a parent's closet or sat beside a hospital bed or watched a community change beyond recognition needs a greeting card all about fresh starts. Death is death. Loss is loss. The water can be deep. But Isaiah says the ransomed of the Lord shall return. Not untouched, not unchanged, but singing. Sorrow and sighing shall flee away. Not because sorrow never mattered, but because sorrow doesn't get the last word. The last word belongs to the God who comforts. The God who makes a way through the sea. The God who washes and buries and raises and names and shelters and sends. The God who says, you are my people. So maybe the church needs more water than we allow ourselves. Not because God forgot the first baptism, but because we forget that baptism tells the truth about every ending that God brings us through. Endings are real. Burial is real. Washing is real. Rising is real. And when a world ends, God is not finished. And the question isn't whether we can go back unchanged. We cannot. The question is whether we will let God bring us through, washed and humbled and altered and alive, and ready to live not as a people waiting to escape the world, but as people brought through the water for the sake of the world. Amen.